Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining our webinar for this month. Today I have Caroline Fitzpatrick, who is an assistant professor at the Université Sainte-Anne in Nova Scotia, where she teaches psychology. She is also an appointed research fellow at the University of Johannesburg in the Department of Childhood Education. Her work addresses the childhood origins of education and health inequities, and the goal of her research is to inform social policies and public health initiatives aimed at improving child physical and mental health. Thank you very much for joining us, Caroline, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So my name is Caroline Fitzpatrick, and it's a true pleasure to be with you today. So just a small change. Sorry, Sylvia, for not letting you know, but I've recently just gotten hired at Université de Sherbrooke as an associate professor in the Department of Preschool and Elementary School Education. So I'm actually in the middle of the move right now, but still very happy to be. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Still very happy to be giving this webinar here with you today. Okay. So I've been interested in the topic of screen time and its influence on children and adolescents' development for the last 10 years. And I'm very happy to be able to share some of my research findings and insights with you today. So just right off the start, I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. My research is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, as well as Research Nova Scotia. So children born into the new millennium have been referred to as the digital generation. And this is in large part due to their unprecedented access to different types of media and different types of media devices. So most preschool age children now have access to mobile devices in the forms of tablets or smartphones. Many children also have home television, often in their bedroom, and households are frequently subscribed to cable, high-speed internet. Satellites are also popular, and many households also have subscriptions to online streaming devices like Netflix. So all of this multiplies children's occasions to view media and also increase the chances that they're going to use media without parental supervision. So media has also found its way into schools. So education ministers across the country encourage the incorporation of media technology with students starting from kindergartens onwards. And finally, most recently, the COVID-19 health crisis has led children's lives to become even more digitized, with entertainment, learning, and socializing now becoming mainly screen-based. So in 2019, the World Health Organization stood by a quite stringent recommendation when it concerns the amount of time that children should spend with screens. So their recommendations, which are also supported by the Canadian Association of Optometrists, are that children before the age of 2 should spend no time with screens. Children between the ages of 2 and 5 should spend a maximum of 1 hour a day with screens. And children above the age of 5 and adolescents should spend a maximum of 2 hours a day with screens. So it's probably not surprising to any of you if I tell you that only about a quarter of children and adolescents actually respect these recommendations. So you might have noticed that I did not mention the Canadian Pediatric Society. In 2019, the Canadian Pediatric Society sort of took a more lenient approach to the amount of time that children should spend with screens, and sort of proposed a more lenient approach that was much less strict than what the World Health Organization was recommending. And this was not met without controversy, considering that the Canadian Pediatric Society also has reported being funded by TELUS. So further controversy has come from stories reporting that some of the most prestigious schools in the Silicon Valley actually provide students with a tech-free environment. Sort of, instead of relying on tablets and technology, have made a return to blackboards and paper and pencil. Further adding to the controversy are statements by tech moguls like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, who have claimed to have raised their children mainly tech-free. So, I mean, all of these issues sort of lead to the question of, does screen time development in children and adolescents? So I've been interested in this question for a while. And when I started studying the effects of screen time approximately 10 years ago, the sample of children that my colleagues and I were following had been growing up in the early 2000s. So that meant that television was still the king of screens. But even back then, there was significant concern over time spent with television and its potential impact on children's development. So in our study, these results that I will present, children mostly spend time with television, but we also measured computer use and video game playing. So I'm going to present a series of studies that we conducted based on data from the Quebec longitudinal study of child development, which is a population-based study of children born between 1998 and 1999 in the province. At its inception, this sample was deemed representative of the demographics of Quebec. And children in the study were followed annually or biannually, so from 5 months and through to early adulthood. So in terms of our predictor, we measured parent reports of child screen time, which was mainly television, but we also measured computer use and video game use. And we measured this at 2.5 and 4.5 years of age. In terms of outcomes, we used direct assessments, self-reports, parent reports, and teacher reports of children's cognitive and social functioning, their health habits, and health indicators such as body mass index. So because this was correlational research, we, in our study, tried to include as many potentially confounding factors as possible. So we also measured maternal education, family configuration and conflict, child temperament and behavior problems, sex, and child sleep. So in terms of the results, we found that the amount of time that children spent with screens between the ages of 2 and 4 was associated with reduced kindergarten classroom engagement, smaller vocabulary, lower scores on assessments of number knowledge, more interpersonal problems, and lower scores on assessments of global motor development. Because we were basing our research on a longitudinal sample, it was possible for us to follow up with these same children towards the end of elementary school. And I'm going to try and, I can't see part of my screen, so I'm just going to try and go from memory of what's coming up next. So it was possible to follow up with these children again around the ages of 10 and 12. And what we found was that children who had spent the most time in front of screens during the preschool years had, again, lower classroom engagement, had lower scores on assessments of mathematics. They also had more interpersonal problems and were more isolated. More time with screens during the preschool years was associated with worse dietary habits, less physical activity, and was also associated with an increased risk of having of becoming overweight. So my colleagues and I also examined how screen time relates to the development of executive functions. So executive functions are cognitive skills that allow children to effortfully and voluntarily control their attention and behavior. So they're extremely important to develop in early childhood. And what we found with an American sample of children is that children who spent the most time in front of screens developed worse executive function skills. And these associations were especially pronounced for children from low income families. And I think this is concerning when we look at data suggesting that screen time seems to be increasing the most rapidly for children in low-income families. So recently, a study from Hutton and his colleagues using brain imagery, which was performed on 70 preschool-age children, found that excessive screen time, so more time spent with screens, was associated with less than optimal brain development, particularly in regions of the brain that are important for executive functions, self-regulation, and language development. So I think this provides some sort of so this provides some support for some of my colleagues and I's observational findings. So I've also been interested in screen time use by adolescents and its consequences. So screen time use in adolescence has certain specific features that distinguish it from young children's use. So adolescents are more likely to use screen media without parental supervision. They're involved in more social media use and are also involved in more gaming. On top of this, adolescents have certain characteristics that are likely to make them particularly vulnerable to certain types of media use. So adolescents are have more emotional reactivity. They're more sensitive to peer influence. They're also more impulsive and more prone to sensation seeking. So adolescents need to navigate a digital world. And this digital world is actually difficult enough for adults to navigate. And one of the reasons why it's difficult to navigate is because it was designed to be difficult to regulate. So certain types of media, in particular interactive media, have been designed by teams of behavioral economists, learning psychologists, and marketers with the specific intent of creating a product that creates habitual and compulsive usage. And they did not fail at this task. So adults have between 30 and 150 interactions with their phones daily. And according to one statistic that I find concerning, 1 in 3 Americans admitted in a survey that they'd rather give up sex than their phone. So adolescents across the country do spend a lot of time with screens. I'm just going to draw your attention on this graph to the yellow bars. So the yellow bars represent adolescents that are exceeding the recommended 2 hours a day of screen time, and also not meeting the recommended 1 hour day minimum of physical activity per day. So they're exceeding screen time and not getting enough physical activity. So across the country, that's approximately 50% of youth. And the number is significantly higher in the province of Quebec. Again, it seems to be the case that tweens and teens from low-income families are spending the most time with screen media. So this led to some questioning from my colleagues and I on how media use by adolescents contributes to their health and well-being. So we conducted a study using data from the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drugs Survey. So this is a representative sample of Canadian adolescents. And it's a sample of approximately 40,000 Canadians. So we measured in our sample media use in terms of television viewing, surfing the internet, and video game playing. And we looked at several well-being indicators, including academic achievement, school connectedness, self-esteem, physical activity, more specifically, moderate to vigorous physical activity, and consumption of fruits and vegetables. So what we found was, first of all, in terms of some descriptives, that Canadian adolescents spent upwards of 5 hours a day across different types of media. Internet use was the most popular, but television and TV and movie viewing and video game playing were also popular. So in terms of our results, we found that quite consistently, media use was associated with negative well-being outcomes. So media use was associated with reductions in academic achievement, lower levels of school connectedness, lower self-esteem, less involvement in moderate to vigorous physical activity, and to a lesser extent, less consumption of fruits and vegetables. These associations were adjusted for grade, ethnicity, province, and some health risk behaviors such as alcohol consumption, smoking, and cannabis use. So just to contextualize these results a little bit, so each hour, for example, of video game use was associated with a 0.07 scale reduction in grades. So this is our scale here. So what does this mean more concretely? So for a student playing less than 2 hours a day, we would get a 0.14 scale reduction, which would correspond to approximately a 2% reduction in their academic average. However, for youth spending 5 hours a day or more playing video games, and these youth do exist, this would correspond to approximately a 5% decrease in academic grades, which I think we can agree is practically significant. So this study ended up attracting a lot of media attention and also resulted in a lot of very unflattering pictures of me online. And the attention for media was quite sensationalized as a reaction to this study. So despite this attention, I was very careful with every journalist I spoke to reiterate that and to clarify that this is cross-sectional data, that it's not possible to establish a causal relationship between the media use and the well-being outcomes, and that in our study, it's also possible that youth who had worse grades or worse self-esteem simply were more drawn towards media use. So correlation does not imply causation. So it's important to conduct additional studies that allow us to better rule out reverse causality and to also control for underlying vulnerability. So using data from the Quebec longitudinal study of child development, my colleagues and I have recently completed some analyses in which we measured media use between the ages of 13 and 15 and associations with psychiatric symptoms and psychological adjustment. So here I'm presenting media use, so total media use across internet use, video game playing, and watching television and movies. And these associations are adjusted for baseline levels of psychiatric and psychological adjustment symptoms and socioeconomic status. So what we found in this study was that more time spent with screens between the ages of 13 and 15 was associated with increases in symptoms of major depression, generalized anxiety, social phobia, and relational aggression. There was also an association for girls between screen time and symptoms of disordered eating. Here we have the associations disaggregated by different types of media use. So these are the associations for girls. And as you can see, it really seems to be the internet use that is the most consistently associated with psychological adjustment and mental health symptoms. So for girls, internet use was associated with more symptoms of major depression, generalized anxiety, disordered eating, as well as higher scores on assessments of impulsivity, conduct disorder, and relational aggression. I'm just gonna, sorry, I can't see my screen. So yeah, and relational aggression, great. For girls, television viewing was also associated with increased risk of disordered eating symptoms. Finally, for boys, again, a similar story emerged. So it also seemed like internet was the most consistently associated with psychological adjustment, with internet use in boys predicting more symptoms of major depression, generalized anxiety, social phobia, and impulsivity. And more recently, some of my colleagues and I have applied more robust longitudinal modeling in the form of multi-level linear modeling to examine how screen time might influence adolescents' behavior and mental health. So multi-level linear modeling allows us to specifically examine within person effects and lagged within person effects, which are two powerful estimates of individual change and individual change over time. So what we found in these two studies was that screen time between the ages of 15 and 17 was associated with reductions in prosocial behavior. So prosocial behavior is the tendency to enact empathy and help others. And we also found that video game use between the ages of 12 and 13 was associated with increased risk of developing symptoms of ADHD in terms of inattention and hyperactivity. So it's important to use, I think, strong longitudinal models. And another thing that's important for me with my current research and moving forward research is to sort of move away from a focus only on screen time to a more comprehensive consideration of screen use. So one of the things I mean by that is that content also matters, regardless of how much time children and youth spend with screens. So decades of research do suggest and support the idea that high quality educational programs such as Sesame Street can actually benefit children's cognitive development and improve their school readiness. Hundreds of studies now also have established a link between violent contents and the development of aggressive and antisocial behavior, while in contrast, children exposed to pro-social content have been shown to show increases in their helping behavior and pro-social behavior. Finally, racial and gender stereotypes are frequent in child-directed media and have been linked to reductions in self-esteem. So even further stressing the importance of content, my colleagues Gregory West and Véronique Bobat conducted a study in which they randomly assigned young adults to either 90 hours of a first-person shooter game or 90 hours of a 3D platform game. And what they found was that those young adults assigned to the first-person shooter game had experienced atrophy in the gray matter of their hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a structure in the brain that's important for learning and memory, but also involved in several mental health disorders such as depression. At the same time, they observed in the participants assigned to the first-person shooter game an increase in the gray matter of the caudate nucleus, which is a structure of the brain that's responsible for addiction and habitual behavior. So content matters, but so does context. And a technoference is of increasing concern to researchers. So technoference refers to the interference of technology in interpersonal relationships. So there is some research suggesting that technoference, or sorry, the cell phone use by parents can reduce their sensitivity and availability towards their children. So future research will need to clarify the extent to which technoference might be influencing child outcomes. Background media has also been linked to child developmental outcomes. So children who grew up in households in which there's more frequent background television are likely to develop smaller vocabularies than children for which this is not the case. And family and community contexts are also important. So children who grow up in more disadvantaged families spend more time with screens, are likely to spend time with screens unsupervised, and are also exposed to more developmentally inappropriate. And in addition, at the community level, there's at least one Australian study suggesting that children who grew up in neighborhoods with more green space spend less time with screens. Finally, I think it's of increasing importance to examine how the consequences of school-based screen time use, or using screens for work or homework, differ from the consequences of home-based or more leisure types of screen-based activities. So I think it's important to adopt a more global consideration of quantity, content, and context when considering the consequences of screen time. And I think it also makes a lot of theoretical and empirical sense to examine the extent to which individual characteristics and individual vulnerabilities, such as sex, temperament, presence of behavior problems, also modify the consequences and the effects of media on children's development. So over the last 10 years, there's been a transformation in the types of screens that are most popular. So old screens, which would encompass television and desktop computers, have different characteristics than new media, which would be tablets and smartphones. So in particular, tablets and smartphones, their use tends to be more personalized. They tend to be used for short amounts of time. They tend to be used intermittently and are more likely to be used in the context of other activities. So these characteristics make them very popular, but have also made them very challenging to measure accurately. So since 2016, I am a member of the Caf Consortium of Researchers. So we are 12 researchers in 7 different countries. And our goal has been to develop a more accurate assessment of family media use, something better able to capture media use, particularly of modern and newer forms of media. Another one of our objectives is to create a shared data platform among members, which will allow us to more easily share data across research sites, increase our sample sizes as well, and ultimately we hope accelerate the speed of scientific discovery on our topic. So our instrument has 3 components: a detailed survey, which includes questions on children's access to different devices within the home, as well as questions on parental attitudes and practices surrounding child's media use. Our assessment also includes a time use diary, which allows parents to record all of the child's activities over the last 24 hours, including media activities. And follow-up questions allow parents to specifically also record the contents of the media and the context of the media use. Finally, we are using a passive sensing application that can be downloaded on portable devices to directly and continuously measure the device use and also the use of different applications throughout the day. So with my colleagues in Nova Scotia, we have just finished collecting media use and data from parents of preschoolers during the COVID-19 health crisis. So we've collected data from 330 families using the CAFE tool, and we plan to follow up with these same families this winter, during which we will again collect media information and also information on developmental outcomes. So by the end of our second data collection wave, we will have information on child and family characteristics. So information like child sex and temperament. We will also have information on parental SES, parenting stress, and some contextual information also regarding the COVID-19 health crisis. So COVID-related changes in work situation or homeschooling of older children. We will also have data on child and parent media use, including the quantity of time children and parents spend with different devices, information on the different types of contents used, and information on context of media use. Finally, we are collecting outcome data on children's physical, social, emotional, and cognitive development. So here's just some sample data from collected from the Chronicle passive sensing application, which was installed on parents' phones. So what we see is that, not surprisingly, parents did not use their cell phones very much between midnight and 6 a.m. And then we sort of see two natural peaks, one around mid-morning and one around supper time. In our study, we also collected qualitative data on parents' experience with media during the COVID-19 health crisis. Here is a response from a parent who explained that screen media played a huge role in COVID. It provided a distraction and helped pass long days. It became very addictive and not in a positive way. I felt a love-hate relationship with the iPad and my feelings of guilt with not being able to provide other experiences because we were locked in the house. So I think this really captures the guilt, some of the struggles and ambivalence that parents have felt using media during the COVID-19 health crisis. And I really do hope that going through these responses will help us better understand the barriers and challenges that families are facing. So, public perception of what is beneficial and healthy for children changes over time. And unfortunately, a lot of public perception is swayed and influenced by industry and marketing. So industry frequently targets or aims contents that are not developmentally appropriate to very young children. So this can include violent games and applications marked as appropriate for 3 to 7-year-olds, even though they include many scenes of violence. And this is just, I guess, as a reminder, because these guidelines are not developed by people that have children and youth's best interest at heart. These industry is essentially motivated by profit. So I think that based on what we do know, the following recommendations are reasonable. So families can, first of all, be encouraged to adopt a media plan, which can include routines, times of the day that are screen free. So for example, dinner time and 1 hour before bedtime. Data does suggest that families that do have a plan and that do set limits have children that spend less time with screens. with the small caveat that overly strict limitations do seem to backfire. But the most successful strategies are likely to be those that are implemented early. Preschool years are important for children's development of preferred activities. So family plans that are implemented early and developing healthy habits early on are more likely, those habits are more likely to be carried forward in later stages of life. For older children and adolescents, the plan's successfulness can benefit if children are included in the process of decision making and establishing of the family plan and routine. Parents can also be encouraged to, as much as possible, co-view with young children, and for older children and adolescents, ask questions about youth's experience with media. And finally, parents can set the example by modeling good media habits themselves. I think for schools, it's increasingly important that media literacy and media competency be specifically included in instruction and curriculum starting in the early years if we want youth to develop healthy, balanced media habits. And given the current COVID-19 health crisis, it's probably even more important now than ever for schools to provide children with the opportunity to move and get physical activity. Healthcare professionals can also play a role by asking questions about children and adolescents' media habits during routine consultations. And finally, I think it might be time to consider some renewed legislation when it comes to the industry, in particular when it comes to media that is directed or frequently used by children and adolescents. So moving forward, I think it will be beneficial for research to employ a comprehensive consideration of media diets that doesn't only focus on screen time, but also considers contents and context. I also think it will be useful to consider individual vulnerability as well as family factors when examining the consequences of screen time and screen use on developmental outcomes. I think that an important priority should be to develop prevention approaches that can be implemented with young children. And finally, I think that in addition to identifying some of the situations under which media is the most harmful to development, it's going to become increasingly important to also identify those situations that are the least harmful and also situations that are the most beneficial to children's development in order to help generate some strategies based on harm reduction and prevention approaches that are useful for parents and governments and healthcare professionals when making decisions about child and adolescent media use. So I would like to thank my team and collaborators and partners and funders. And with that, I will now be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for a really interesting talk. As you were talking, I was actually likening screen time to what's happened in kids nutritionally, where in terms of advertising nutritional, like junky foods to children, or placement of boxes even, or I guess the cereal boxes and things, the sugary ones, are placed at like kids levels and things, so they ask their parents for it. So there's a lot of parallels that I kind of drew between child's nutrition and the screen time. I see we have a few questions here. One question is, does TV qualify as screen time? And I actually like to add to that, because I also wonder whether things like video FaceTime, like the FaceTime or video chats that we're increasingly doing because we can't see our loved ones in this COVID epidemic, does that actually count as part of screen time as well?
So I'll answer the question about television first, then the question about the video chat. So the question with television, yes, television is considered screen time. Whether it's watching a program on cable or other, or streaming, yes, it would be considered screen time. It's the sort of original screen time that's been studied. In terms of the video chat, it's a very interesting question. Initially, some of the pediatric societies were saying no screen time before the age of 2, with the exclusion of video chat. So video chat was often excluded from those recommendations, and considered to have many positive effects, including improved communication skills, increased social competence, ability to stay in touch with relatives. So there are a lot of positives to video chats. The only caveat I would mention is that it still has that an extreme amount of time with video chat can still have harmful effects on children's eyes. And that is why the Canadian Association of Optometrists doesn't make that allowance, whereas the psychological and pediatric associations tend to. So there's still that risk, but I would say in terms of screen time, it's probably one of the most beneficial ones.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. And I have another question here. According to you, what is the most effective, most objective, accurate, and impartial process to report screen time?
Well, I think the application that can be downloaded on a phone gives a pretty direct assessment, considering that the parent didn't deactivate it or swipe out of their phone. But we can tell that when we download the data, whether the parents left the application running for the full 48 hours or 72 hours that we're measuring with. So that would be one of the most direct ways of measuring the screen time. The other limitation of the app use is that if we're trying to get children's tablet use, well, another member of the family could be using the tablet and not the child itself. So some of my colleagues have used combinations of the application with video cameras installed in families' homes, which I mean can really reassure in terms of reliability, but is also very invasive and costly process. So I think the best way that I figured with my team is to use multiple different ways, and then to sort of cross-reference them, and to look at their correlations, and to examine these different measures and different amounts that we get based on the medium.
Thank you. And also, I see as a follow-up, while exploring the relationship with screen time and cognitive ability, we found an initial rise in cognitive ability with screen time, followed by a drastic drop. How can that initial rise be justified?
That's interesting. Can I ask what age group, and if there was any kind of specific content that they were viewing?
That's a good question. I only have that question in the Q&A. I'm not sure if that participant could perhaps expand a little bit. It was submitted by Kumi Dutta.
Yeah, so I think there would be a lot of things to consider here. The time between measurements. So initially, is it over weeks, months, the time frame, and also in terms of if there's any information on the content, the age of the children.
I've got it. Content was not checked. Age group 8 to 15.
8 to 15. So I'm just giving a sort of a hypothesis here. It could be that the types of contents that 8-year-olds are viewing are mostly educational. As they get older, they might be viewing a lot less educational types of content. So that's one hypothesis that I could propose right off the bat.
Okay, thank you very much. In your studies, you found internet had the most detrimental effects over TV and video games, I believe. Hold on, wait, it just moved. What exactly does internet encompass? Social media, scrolling, I guess.
So based on other studies of what do youth do when they're online, it would be mostly social media, viewing videos on YouTube, playing video games. So and a little bit of between gender differences. Girls would be spending a little bit more time on social media, and boys spending a little bit more time with video games. So those are probably the activities that are mostly would be driving those associations.
Okay. And have you examined exergaming at all? What are your thoughts on exergaming?
I have not examined exterior gaming specifically, but it's an interesting, it's a very interesting question, and might be potentially one of those forms of media use that can be, if you're going to use media, might as well substitute with the one that's least harmful and possibly even beneficial to certain outcomes. So, but unfortunately, I don't have data to speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then another question I have here is, okay, wait, the questions keep on moving. So, okay, in the first study presentation, screen time for young kid group seems to be an issue for mathematics. Why not for language learning as well?
Interesting, again, very interesting question. So, there actually have been some mixed results with the language learning. So if a child's watching a lot of educational content, they might actually be benefiting on their vocabulary. In our sort of all types of contents confounded, we did not find those effects, but it might be the case that some of the media aimed at children can benefit vocabulary, whereas most media doesn't expressly or explicitly try to transmit mathematical skills. And media also seems to undermine attention and executive functions, which are extremely important for math achievement. So I would suspect that it's something along those lines.
Very interesting. I do have a question for you with regards to educational games. Because we talk about how, oh well, the educational TV, like maybe Sesame Street, or educational games or things might actually be beneficial for children. Now, how does that fit in with regards to our screen time guidelines? I've kind of often wondered, because a lot of the times, my kids will be playing, like for my example, my 3-year-old likes to play these games that involve counting or pattern recognition or something like that on the iPad. But then I still want to limit their screen time. So how does that factor in with regards to screen time?
I would say that if the child's going to be, and this is the case for even young children, there's a recommendation for hours per day, but beyond that, most pediatricians and developmental psychologists will also recommend that if the child is going to spend time with screens during the preschool years, it should be educational and have an educational value to it. So I think that's a great suggestion for parents, is if the child's going to get some screen time to keep them occupied, distracted, then it should be as much as possible educational screen time.
Okay, so it would still fit within like the limitations that they're suggesting, I guess, to limit its effects. So I'm guessing on motor function and things. Is that it?
Yeah. I'd say at the moment it would still count in the daily allowance, in the daily limitation, which is one of the problems with just looking at the hours of screen time, because there's possibly some quite beneficial contents that children can do, and them spending 2 hours with the screen is probably not the same as a child doing 1 hour of just purely game entertainment based media. So I think that kind of speaks to the idea that why it's important to also consider contents and the context of usage. But yes, I think formally that would count in the 1 hour limitation.
Sure. Fair enough. Most of the TV shows in our youth were quite violent, i.e. Roadrunner, Tom and Jerry, etc. How do you compare it with today's video games and its effects?
Oh, very, very interesting question. The study that I would think of the most, and not a lot of people have looked at sort of, specific brain studies on children and adolescents, but I'm just reminded of West and Bobot's work on these violent first-person shooter games, where they actually found differences in brain gray matter. So there does seem to be something specific to video games. Now, is it the violence, or is it the addictive nature of them, or is it the rewarding nature of them? That's still not possible to disentangle, but there does also seem to be some research suggesting that the more realistic violence is, the more likely it is to have an impact on children, either by increasing their aggressive behavior, or in other children that are a bit more empathetic and timid, it can also create fearfulness and emotional distress in children. So I think the realism does matter.
That's very interesting. I was reminded of a science fair. I was judging my daughter's school science fair, and there were these two kids that were actually doing their science project on video games and violence in video games, because I guess one of their parents is a professor of psychology. So he wanted to disprove his mom. Something like and then he found that actually his mom was right, because it increased aggressive behavior and things. Like, he was like, okay.
That's so
So it's
cute.
kind of cute. Okay, so I have another question here. How does screen time affect the time of food intake? For example, eating occasion time.
Oh, that is really, really interesting. I wish I had an answer. Um, I might be able to tease some information out from my time diaries. So we have recordings of when families are eating, and whether they're using media during eating activities. So I don't know, it might be possible to look at if more heavy media using families eat at more irregular hours, or spend less time on meal time. So those are things that I might be able to potentially address, but I'm not sure if I can answer that right now.
Yeah, I know historically, when not in terms of actual timing of meals, but in terms of actually consuming food while watching a screen, it overrides a lot of the cues of hunger and satiation that occur. As you're watching a screen, you tend to not pay attention to how full you are, for example, as you're eating. So there is some associations there, but I wasn't sure in terms of actual meal timing in the families. I have another question here. Will you be examining what is going on in the family outside the screens, like living with grandparents and not going to school, family dynamics such as amount of siblings and what is going on in the family in the family around them, family conflicts, amount of time spent with family being educated outside of the screen time, etc.
Yeah, we're trying to, in the Nova Scotia sample, take into account some of the larger family context. So, um, information surrounding job changes, so working from home, loss of job, in either parents, caring for other relatives. We do have information on child care and number of siblings. So these are some things that we're going to try and examine, and parenting stress also, which I think is a good proxy for sort of, if we can't capture, sorry, there's we just got an alert in Nova Scotia, so I'll check it
Oh,
after. So I think parenting stress becomes a good proxy for a lot of different family variables and mechanisms that we might not all be able to capture, but at least we will have that parenting stress measure included.
okay. And as a follow-up, she also asked, will you be examining amount of physical exercise and types of physical exercise? For example, a video game done with family members that includes exercise like a dance game versus outdoor exercise.
So we will be, yeah. So we will be collecting the types of games that children are playing. Um, because the children are young, I don't know how many are going to be doing the more physical, and how much video game playing there is. It tends to be more app use, tablet use, children's programs. But we it's possible that it'll come out. We're looking also at, so in the time diary, we ask for specific activities throughout the day. So parents will also record how much time the child spent playing, being physically active, playing outside, and those types of activities. And we've included as well questions surrounding how many hours per day on average children spend in imaginary play, playing outside, reading books, and drawing. So some other types. We do have some information on habitual activities that children are engaged in.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then another question, how is it possible to make screen rules for children when the adults never follow the rules themselves?
Yeah. So that's a really important point. Parents screen time habits are a predictor of children's screen time habits. So I think it's important to sensitize parents as much as possible to that idea that their habits are very likely to be important determining factors in their children's eventual media habits. And that's, I mean, As adults, yes, media has an influence on us, but these are children with fully developing brains. It's extremely important if we want them to have the best chances at emotional health, physical health, cognitive health later on to, you know, ensure that they have a variety of activities that they can engage in.
Okay, we've got some great questions. Okay, so other question is, some games seem to be quite educational, such as Minecraft. Would these types of games be beneficial?
Well, maybe just as an example, my colleague who studied video games on the brain found that games like Minecraft, Tetris, 3D, what she calls 3D platform games, like where you have to navigate a certain environment, actually can improve the gray matter in the hippocampus. So games that ask you to do visual spatial tasks don't seem to have the same negative effects on the brain. Um, After that, well, I think there's always the consideration of too much sedentary time is still too much sedentary time. So even if you're playing a game that's beneficial for the brain, um, children, adolescents also need face-to-face interactions. They need outdoor time and they need physical activity.
Okay, and this other one is also a very good question. Can social or psychological adverse effects of too much screen time be reversed?
I strongly believe so. I think that the more prolonged, so it depends on how many years the excessive screen time happens, and during what years. Um, like anything, if a child is deprived of social interactions, either because of the screen or for other reasons, they will face social functioning difficulties. So I think that's sort of the one of the ways to look at it. So if screen is taking away time from social activities and socializing, the children's not developing the skills, they do run a risk of these problems becoming permanent. But I would like to think that many of these difficulties that children are experiencing can be reversed through intervention, through training, through social skills training, um, and by developing more healthy, balanced habits.
Mhm. And let's see, I'm just looking at the time. I have time for one more question, I think. Can you tell us about how the intensity of light in lux from the screen is important along with the duration? Does the recommendation on duration of screen exposure take intensity of light into account?
Um, so I think it would probably depend on who the recommendation is coming from. So I think the optometrist would be the most concerned with light coming from the screen. Um, I think that developmental psychologists are particularly or have been concerned with displacement of other activities. So more so, less so with the physical features of the screen, and more so with, well, if the child's spending more than an hour a day with screens, are they getting enough time to interact with their caregivers, play outside, play with their explore their environment, and do other things that are important for healthy development.
I guess just a related question was whether those blue light glasses work.
I unfortunately cannot answer that. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them.